Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I did set it to mute participants upon joining. Doesn't mean you'll be muted the entire evening, but we want to allow Laura to present some information to you. So far, we've got about 32 participants joined, so we're going to give it a few minutes, maybe till like 3 after 6, and allow enough people to join so they don't miss out on any information. Um, we have Laura Diemer from FB Environmental here with us this evening, and she's going to present to you the findings of the core sediment sampling we did in August. And then we will give everyone an opportunity to raise hand. Hopefully you all know where that function is on Zoom at the bottom. But you can raise your hand and we'll go around and ask questions. The meeting is being recorded. You probably noticed that when you joined. You had to accept that. So we will be sharing this recording on our website and out in a link via email. There is a town meeting this evening on the Brownsfield project. So there are a lot of participants that wanted to join and were conflicted. So we may not have as big a turnout this evening, but I know there are a lot of people that are interested in viewing the recording. So this will be the first of several series on this. Tonight is the introduction to the information that we've received back from the lab. So looks like I'm going to give it maybe another minute or so, and then I will turn it over to Laura. Okay, great. Hopefully everyone can see Laura's screen. Laura, I'd love to pass the talking stick over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm looking forward to digging into the results tonight. As Kelly said, my name is Laura Diemer. I'm a certified lake manager and senior project manager at FB Environmental Associates. I lead our lake services work. We were hired to collect and analyze sediment cores to evaluate Spofford Lake's vulnerability to internal phosphorus loading. And I'm going to, explain what that is and why we're concerned about it. But first, I just wanted to start with the basics to just kind of set the stage. I think we're all familiar with a watershed. It's the land area where all water collects and drains to a common point, such as a lake. But that water is not pure. It interacts with all the land surfaces and soils in that watershed, and it can pick up and carry various minerals, nutrients, and contaminants into surface waters. This is the watershed area for Spofford Lake that you see in the orange outline. So just to orient you, we're looking southwest with the outlet in the foreground. The watershed itself covers about just shy of 4 square miles. So all the rain that falls in this area eventually makes its way to all the feeder tributaries that enter the lake. And then it outlets here to Partridge Brook, which flows to the Connecticut River. So whatever the water picks up along the way throughout the watershed is also being carried into the lake. So at one point in time, many decades ago, and I've shared these series of slides in a previous talk, the Spofford Lake watershed was heavily logged and farmed, which sent lots of organic material into the lake, where a significant portion did settle into the lake sediments. And over time, the area's forests grew back. Farms were replaced with residential development. Development around the shoreline really expanded pretty rapidly after 1980, and that coincided with changes to dam operations that increased lake levels. We also saw the increase in the number and power of motorized watercraft on the lake, and so more runoff from developed areas combined with higher water levels and more boat wakes has really enhanced shoreline erosion and the sedimentation of organic material into the lake. And we're particularly interested and concerned about the nutrient phosphorus. So just to further illustrate this and why it's important, here's a profile view of a lake system. All those sources of phosphorus from the watershed as runoff, groundwater, the atmosphere, also waterfowl. They contribute to elevated phosphorus concentrations in the lake. Some of this phosphorus settles into the sediments and builds up in the sediment over time. So that organic rich sediment at the bottom of Spofford Lake enhances microbial decomposition, which consumes oxygen. So when the lake becomes what we call thermally stratified, that means it's warm at the surface and it's cool at the bottom. It creates a density gradient that prevents mixing and replenishment of oxygen to those waters until the lake turns over in the fall. So the bottom of the lake goes anoxic, meaning little to no oxygen, which triggers the release of phosphorus from sediment, otherwise known as internal phosphorus loading. And that internal phosphorus loading provides a vital source of nutrients at a pretty critical time of year for cyanobacteria growth. And then when we consider climate change, it's really enhancing all of these processes, and it makes it more difficult to curtail cyanobacteria dominance with nutrient management alone. Cyanobacteria are well suited to adapting to these changes and extremes, especially compared to other algae, and they can just more easily dominate the system. So in response to this, in 2024, I helped SLA design and deploy a submerged buoy with a series of loggers that were measuring temperature and dissolved oxygen at various depths at the deepest spot of the lake. So the diagram you see on the far right is just a rough illustration of what the buoy setup looks like in the water. There's kind of a main taunt anchor line attached to a submerged buoy, which sits about 6 feet below the water surface. A second line hangs off more freely with sensors attached at specific depths, from the surface to the bottom of the lake. The photo on the left is Art assisting with the initial deployment. And then the other photo is the submerged buoy, looking down at it from the boat. So this buoy will allow SLA to keep track of temperature and oxygen patterns year after year. So we can track trends in turnover events, how long and stratification extends throughout the season, and also trying to characterize how long and how severe those low oxygen conditions at lake bottom are occurring every year. And this is all important and linked to the degree of internal phosphorus loading in the lake. So then in 2025, this year, we were hired to collect and analyze 12 sediment cores from various locations around the lake to give us a better understanding of how much phosphorus is in the sediment and how much is potentially releasable under low oxygen conditions. We sampled at a variety of depths along 2 primary flow transects, both within and outside of the current low oxygen area of the lake. The photos you see are showing all 12 sediment cores that were collected and just, what they looked like and kind of the range of characteristics that they had. Most of them were fairly consistent, kind of a loose, watery, grayish brown coloration. Most sites had very low organic content, even in shallow areas. There was some evidence of oxidation anywhere you see kind of a orange, reddish orange color, like at site 11 and site 7 here. And then I just want to point out site 9. So on this map here, site 9, it's right at it was our shallowest site right at the outlet of the lake. And you can see in the photo, there's a lot more coarser material in here, sand and gravel that's most likely from road washouts, which is not uncommon at outlets of lakes. So we can use the sediment data to determine how much phosphorus is potentially releasable from sediment now and also in the future. So I'm not going to go into details on all the calculations that went into this or show you the figures. I wanted to keep it high level, but just know that information is summarized in the write-up that was provided to SLA for anyone who's interested. For this presentation, I'm just going to show the data a little bit more abstractly. So you're just seeing a scale here from 0 to 400 kilograms per year, representing the mass of internal phosphorus load. Based on water quality data, which provides what we call a partial net estimate of internal phosphorus load, we're estimating that to be about 56 to 85 kilograms per year. So this is really our yardstick for comparing to the estimates that we get from the sediment data. So there are a couple different methods for estimating internal load from sediment data. One method shows a net internal load of about 48 kilograms per year, all the way up to a gross of 182. Using that same method, but then accounting for the organic fraction, is a much larger potential range. And then there's two other methods that fall between 23 and 87 and 37 and 141. So overall, what this tells me, and why I'm showing it this way, is that these results are quite comparable to what we're actually measuring in the water column, with the exception of this method. So this method, accounting for the organic fraction, is a bit too high from what we're actually seeing in the water. So that just tells us that the organic phosphorus is likely not a strong contributor to the internal phosphorus load, at least for Spofford Lake at this time. So based on this, we do confirm that the internal phosphorus load to Spofford Lake is somewhere around 19 to 26% of the total phosphorus that's contributing to the lake. So here's a map that's showing the current anoxic or low oxygen extent in Spofford Lake, which is representing about 14 meters and deeper in the reds and oranges here. This is really the area that's largely contributing to that internal phosphorus load, the 19 to 26% that I'm talking about. With the sediment data, we are able to quantify the future anoxic extent if it were expanded to, say, 12 meters. So adding this yellow area to the already anoxic red and orange areas on the map. And sediment data tells us that that could increase the internal load to Spofford Lake to somewhere between 25 upwards of 42% of the total load to the lake, which is significant. So this potential transition will really be crucial to track. Internal phosphorus loading is at that tipping point threshold right now, around that 20% mark. Once the lake starts to shift to this state of anoxia and internal load starts to climb closer to 30, 40% or higher, this is going to push the system into a new unbalanced state that's really going to favor cyanobacteria blooms. This is why SLA has done so well ramping up monitoring efforts in anticipation of this shift so that you can be ready to take some meaningful action. But every lake is different. That 20% rule of thumb internal phosphorus loading that I mentioned, in one lake could impact water quality and biological response very differently than another lake. So it's really important to understand how is that actually playing out in your lake. So what is the current biological response for Spofford Lake? So Spofford Lake does have a history of both benthic and planktonic cyanobacteria that is a concern for the health of not only us but our pets and aquatic life. And I'll explain the difference between those two types of cyanobacteria. So first, Spofford Lake has suffered from blooms occurring as these dark green, kind of black looking mats of benthic cyanobacteria. So benthic cyanobacteria are cyanobacteria that grow on the lake bottom and often in shallower areas where light can penetrate to the sediments. And these mats can often wash up on the shore, as we see in Spofford Lake almost every year from what I've heard. So, and particularly along the northwestern shoreline of Spofford Lake. Now, planktonic cyanobacteria that I mentioned are cyanobacteria that grow in the water column and are kind of the more traditional green soup appearance when referring to blooms or when you think of blooms. These types of blooms have also presented as shoreline accumulations, again, along that western shoreline of Spofford Lake. These are a couple pictures that were shared with me by SLA. And you can see kind of green ribbons or clouds of surface scum that were concentrating along the shoreline by, wind or wave action. So far, these blooms have kind of come and gone very quickly, lasting a few hours up to maybe a day or two before they dissipate. So nothing that's severe or persistent has been documented yet. But these shoreline accumulations are likely happening every year now, especially around fall turnover. These two blooms that you see pictured here were sampled and sent off for toxin analysis at a lab. And for the 4 major toxins they were analyzed for, they came back as non-detect, which is great to see. Now, the VLAP program that SLA partners with, they collect phytoplankton data for most years. And so this figure is just from one of their recent reports showing the relative abundance of the major types of algae in the water column. And this is just at the deep spot of the lake. So focusing just on the cyanobacteria in purple shows that they were the dominant cyanobacteria, at least in 2013, 2017, and 2019, but less so in recent years, 2022 to 2024. So these two types of cyanobacteria do have important differences in their growth strategies, which influences where they get their nutrients, how they affect water quality, and ultimately how we manage them. So I did want to pause to talk about this a little bit more because it helps us understand next steps with management actions. So benthic cyanobacteria are typically found in the shallower oxic areas of the lake where sunlight can easily penetrate to the bottom sediment. And they actually tend to thrive in lower nutrient, good quality waters because they have that high water clarity that allows for more light to hit the bottom, just like what we see in Spofford Lake. They can extract what they need for phosphorus and other elements directly from the sediment where they grow. So in mid to late summer, these mats dislodge from the bottom sediments, rise to the surface, and then they're washing up on the shorelines about that time. So now planktonic cyanobacteria can be a little bit more complicated since they do have part of their life cycle, their resting stage in the sediments, but then they grow in the water column. And some can regulate their buoyancy and move around to access sunlight and nutrients they need. So when oxygen is depleted in late summer and that internal loading kicks in and pumps phosphorus into the water, that phosphorus starts to build up in the bottom water. And then around fall turnover, the water column mixes, which replenishes oxygen, but mixes up that higher nutrient water near the surface for cyanobacteria to take up. These cyanos will then, at the end of their life cycle and season, will tend to rise up in the surface where they can be carried by wind and wave action to concentrate along the shoreline, those shoreline accumulations that I mentioned. So you can see that these two types of cyanobacteria, which Spofford Lake is experiencing, they are different. And so there's different management considerations for both of them. Reducing the internal load in deeper areas of the lake would likely not have much impact on the benthic cyanobacteria growth in the lake, but could help control planktonic cyanobacteria growth if it were to get worse. So I think this is an important point to make. I mentioned Spofford Lake is facing a potential tipping point. The lake is under threat from excessive nutrient loading and will eventually shift to a cyanobacteria-dominated system, but it isn't quite there yet. Right now, Spofford Lake is experiencing occasional shoreline accumulations of the planktonic cyanobacteria that I'm talking about, but they're tending to be short-lived and non-persistent. Lakes that have reached their tipping point look more like this. You've got whole lake, severe cyanobacteria blooms that make the water look like pea soup or paint. And so we're at the stage now where we want to make sure that this doesn't happen to Spofford Lake. We don't want Spofford Lake to ever get to this point, which is why, continuing the monitoring and bloom documentation is so critical so that we can track the rate at which the lake is shifting to this tipping point and when is the most appropriate time to jump in with any sort of in-lake management measure. I do have a couple case studies for you to give some perspective. Two very different lakes in New Hampshire, both with internal loading issues that were driving severe whole lake cyanobacteria blooms. This first example is Lake Kennesaca in Moultonborough. This lake had some history of infrequent shoreline accumulations of cyanobacteria, very similar to Spofford Lake. But then it hit a very abrupt tipping point around 2020 that then escalated each year in severity up until fall of 2023 when the entire lake turned green, which is the photo that you're looking at here. The lake did receive an alum treatment in the spring of 2024 to reduce the internal load, but the external watershed load was and continues to be the dominant source of nutrients to this particular lake. So they're working really hard to address those issues and try to control these cyanobacteria blooms. Their internal load was also around that 20 to 25% mark prior to the alum treatment, which is a similar range as Spofford Lake. The second example is Partridge Lake in Littleton. This lake has been experiencing severe year-round blooms, even under the ice, which you can see the middle picture here is a sample collected under the ice. It's been suffering from this for decades. This has been a very long problem for this community. A huge portion of the lake goes anoxic for the majority of the year. It gets a very short reprieve from that at the turnover periods in spring and fall, but it immediately goes anoxic shortly after. The internal load here is much higher. It's over 50% of the load to this particular lake. It did receive an alum treatment this past spring that I led, and they've also been doing lots of work in the watershed to reduce nutrient runoff. So in-lake management it's a huge undertaking. It needs lots of data to justify, especially for permitting through the state. It should never be jumped into without careful consideration of alternative options and weighing their pros and cons when we're trying to think about ecological risk, effectiveness, and of course, cost. And I want to emphasize that all in-lake management options have some level of risk. So I'm just going to run through a few common ones, but there's dozens of options available, many of which are only applicable to certain types of lakes or conditions though. So first, because I've already mentioned it a couple times, and it's fairly commonly used throughout the US and particularly New England, is alum. So alum reduces the internal phosphorus load by about 80 to 90%. Usually it maxes out at about 90%. It is highly effective. It does come with some short-term risk, but it's well controlled if it's well designed and carried out The cost, though, can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars or more, just depending on, how much and how long the treatment needs to be for any particular lake. Usually they can be done as a one-time treatment. Sometimes they're split over a couple years, and they should last at least a few years, if not up to a decade or more. Again, this depends on the individual lake and the watershed sources that are contributing. Another type of in-lake management treatment that I know has been brought up before by this group is aeration or oxygenation. These are actually two slightly different techniques, but generally both are trying to oxygenate the water. And if you target the bottom water with oxygen to try to reduce the severity of anoxia in the bottom that's triggering internal load, you can theoretically reduce the internal load. The results can be mixed, though, and gets into the differentiation between aeration and oxygenation systems. The technology is really still evolving, and it can be really tricky if it's not done properly. Past issues that I've seen with these types of systems is they've promoted mixing during the summer, especially in deeper lakes when you want to keep that bottom waters down there that might have some higher phosphorus levels. And that mixing can actually fuel cyanobacteria growth and actually make conditions worse. And even if you do it properly, the reduction that you see for internal loading is just overall less efficient than using something like alum. And you would need to operate it every year for the foreseeable future. The initial cost and then annual maintenance obviously can add up pretty quickly. Ballpark, it's at least $100,000 to set up initially, and then, at least like $50,000 or more each year to pay for maintenance. And obviously you would need to hire someone to do it with that has the technical expertise. And finally, I will mention algicides. Algicides really should only be used in emergency situations, like say in drinking water reservoirs. And even then, it's tricky. There's, of course, several different types of algicide, copper sulfate being historically the most commonly used. These are essentially, poisons, right, that we're adding to the water to kill cyanobacteria, but they often also kill or stress out other aquatic life. And they kill the cyanos by breaking through their membranes, which can release toxins into the water. So I've seen cyanos also transition to more resistant strains when repeated treatments are performed, so that more and more needs to get added to kill them. So it's certainly not a long-term solution and only treats the symptom, not the problem of nutrients like alum or indirectly oxygenation. So I also want to mention that unfortunately there's few management options for controlling benthic cyanobacteria other than trying to focus on reducing nutrient sources from the watershed that are enriching those nearshore lake sediments where the benthic cyanobacteria are growing. I know that DES is looking at providing more guidance on how to potentially properly handle shoreline wash-ups to clear them off the shore quickly and safely. Okay, so wrap up in summary. This is all to say that certainly the results from this year show that Spofford Lake is vulnerable to internal phosphorus loading, and it may be at an important tipping point towards a future cyanobacteria-dominated system. But we're not quite there yet, at least not to move forward immediately with any in-lake management treatment. So, which is why right now we aren't recommending any immediate actions towards that yet. We do recommend that you continue watershed work according to the 2018 plan. You're already doing amazing work. You're 2 phases into the 319 implementation grants. You've done some really great ordinance work. So that is all so beneficial to protecting your lake. Of course, continuing the monitoring efforts, just outstanding job with the robust monitoring program that you have, including the new buoy setup. Some things to consider for next year. I did recommend, just maybe taking a few extra phosphorus samples at more depths in the water column throughout the summer to just have 1 year of robust data to really refine that internal phosphorus load estimate based on the water quality data. I also recommended plankton sampling, which is already done at least once, if not a few times a summer. It would be great to enhance that if we could do monthly plankton sampling from, say May to October, and have those analyzed not only for phytoplankton, but also zooplankton. So the zooplankton feed on the algae or the phytoplankton, and they're a really important top-down control on the algae, including cyanobacteria. So it would be very interesting to understand the seasonal dynamics in what's dominant and when for both algae and the zooplankton that feed on the algae, and how those two interact and potentially, benefit and control cyanobacteria throughout the season or not. And then a final recommendation for the monitoring is trying to perform a benthic cyanobacteria survey. Boating along that western shoreline to try to document where those benthic cyanobacteria are actually growing on the sediment, before they're washing up on the shorelines, what the extent of it is, and what type of species are in those mats. We can take some subsamples and analyze them under the microscope, just to set a baseline of where is this growing, and how big is it, so that we could go back, in a couple years and maybe remeasure it and see if it's getting worse. And then the last thing is, our recommendation is to try to document all bloom forms, and also be sure to notify DES just so they're aware and have it for their records. We do need documentation of blooms to understand where it's getting worse over time. Right now, we don't have enough evidence for DES to permit any in-lake nutrient management right now. So if Spofford Lake becomes a candidate for an in-lake management technique in the future, DES will require thorough documentation that describes the problem and justifies the approach in the permit application. So all of the data collection that's been done so far feeds right into that and is so important for that future work. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great, Laura. There was a question in the chat, I think from Lauren Turner. Yeah. So if you can see it, if not, I'm happy to read it out loud for the group. It said, I'm concerned about the proposal to wait and see, since we know from physical observation that there is benthic cyanobacteria from Route 63 shoreline up through North Shore Road. I'm not sure why we would wait to assess the prevalence of this mat bacteria rather than taking remedial action now. Prevention is so important to prevent risks of further decline of lake quality. So I think, that came in prior to you discussing further, but I didn't know if you wanted to comment more on that, or Lauren, if you wanted to extrapolate on that question with Lauren with Laura.
Yeah, no, I can, see the concern, and hopefully maybe that was answered later in my presentation. The management techniques for benthic cyanobacteria in particular are fairly limited, right? Because they're growing on the sediments. So even if they grew in the season and you tried to extract them from the sediments, right? It would never be a full extraction. It would always leave behind seeds to regrow later, right? It's very similar to, like an invasive plant issue, right? It's an enormous effort, and it's highly disturbing to your system. You'd be potentially exacerbating the situation because any sort of extraction would disturb sediments and uh, suspend that material, including phosphorus, into the water column, where then it could be exacerbate a planktonic cyanobacteria bloom issue. So, I'm certainly not saying, just, sit on your hands and nothing can be done. Certainly not saying that. It's just emphasizing, where those um, enriched sediments originally came from, right? And it came from the watershed, and trying to focus always on continuing to reduce that watershed load source into the lake, is going to protect your lake in the long run. And then, yeah, with the benthic, unfortunately, there's really not many options. So it's really trying to get a sense for the extent of it, and maybe looping DES more into the conversation to talk about future possibilities with that.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to add, and then I see James has his hand up, Chris Oot, and we have a question came in from Tim Mosier as well, and Doug Baxter. So we'll take those in order. But I wanted to reiterate what Laura said at the end of her presentation, that, as you all know, the lake is owned by the state. And we can't make a unilateral decision to do any kind of remedial action. It would have to be a permit that is given to us by the state. So we have to have adequate information and data for the state to feel that remedial action is necessary and to be able to receive a permit to do any of these treatments. So, as Laura mentioned, we haven't seen enough activity or documented well enough the activity of the cyanobacteria and the different types that we have on the lake. So, that is something that we're going to be asking, groups, homeowners, everyone to help us with that effort so that we can begin to really document the activity that we see, because I know we all want to see some action taken. We're all interested homeowners here, but we wouldn't be able to do that at this stage anyway with the state. We don't have enough documentation that the lake needs that yet. So I just wanted to make sure I clarified that. But James, your hand was up next.
See if I can unmute myself. Uh, three,
Success.
three quick things. One, happy to do more samples in the summer if you want to do that. That's good. The sort of scary photo on the shoreline, I think we determined after the fact that that was most likely contractors washing out their paint and grout buckets from a construction project right there, based on the way it continued and how quickly it moved out when I ran my
Actually, we
boat.
did test your sample and it was
There
cyanobacteria.
was a little in there, but
Yeah.
um, I think
But it dissipated almost before I could go grab a
it
sample. Luckily, you
dissipated
had grabbed one.
immediately, and there were people washing out buckets after that. So that one's probably not as scary. Not that I'm not concerned. And the third is, and I know I've got this, but the lake drawdown, um, to me, does not seem to be well managed. I believe that it should be drawn down briskly in the fall so we get the shoreline exposed at the level it needs to be, and kept there certainly at ice out, put some boards back in, make sure it comes up from the summer. But right now we're 6 or 8 inches higher than what I think we should be now, which, um, leaves us with a greater chance, if we get the tail end of a storm or something, the water level's going to be up over summer level, into the shore, which is bad from a nutrient erosion and all point of view. I know I asked Laura when we were out on the boat this summer doing the samples about a drawdown, and I talked about aggressive drawdowns, but I think she may have taken that as being feet, and really just getting it down a foot from normal summer level and keeping it there was what I was thinking, because that exposes a lot of shore. And my question to her would be, would that help with the benthic matting a bit so that that's not underwater for the winter season?
Hmm.
That's I think the water quality was very good last year, and we had the biggest drawdown that we've had in a number of years to accomplish the boat landing work. And the water level came back to normal summer level. We had the drought, and you can't do much about a drought, but it did get there, and then it evaporated. That's it. I'll put my hand down.
Right. Laura, do you have any comments on the lake level? I know I saw another come in the chat. I think that we need to differentiate summer and winter level, because
Mhm.
summer, when the water's much warmer, and it's shallower and heats up and the sunlight gets through. I think that's what Laura was saying too. The shallower can create more benthic mats, but the drawdown in the winter is very important consideration. Laura, I don't know if you have any comments, but if this group
Yeah.
knows, that's managed by the town. It's an agreement with DES on what the levels should be, but the management of how it's drawn down and when is not regulated, and it does need some serious consideration, and for SLA probably to try to work with the town even more to have an effective drawdown plan.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, and thanks, James, for the comments and the question. Yes, drawdown has been used in various ways as a control mechanism, largely for aquatic plants. So I think it has potential, right? And going back to my slide, right? It's like every management option has a pro and a con, right? There's nothing that we do that doesn't come with a little bit of an issue with it. So with drawdown, we would just need to understand where those benthic cyanobacteria mats are actually growing, and that if you drew the lake down to a certain level, is it actually exposing where those benthic mats are growing, or are they deeper off and we can't, draw it down that much? If we are able to expose where those mats are growing, then yes, right, you're exposing that sediment to air, and so it's undergoing desiccation, and that can kill the cyanobacteria, what we call the aconites. Those are the seeds, I guess, or the spores, however you want to define it, but those are the reproductive structures that the cyanobacteria leave behind to then grow for the next season. And so those stay in the sediments, and they can stay there for a long time. But if they are desiccated for a long enough time at a cold enough temperature, it can kill them off. So, but I do caution you, desiccation has also shown for the next season to increase phosphorus release from the sediment. So you could kill off the benthic cyanobacteria and slightly increase phosphorus in the water column that could fuel planktonic cyanobacteria. So it's never a simple answer is what I'm trying to say. But I think if you wanted to explore that, I'd be willing to explore that with you as well. I could provide some like a literature write-up of the pros and cons for that. But I think we would definitely need to wait and map out where those benthic mats are, and then relate that to the level that you would draw it down to make sure that they're actually would be exposed over the winter.
Right. Chris? You're next.
Yeah, Laura, great presentation. You covered a lot of ground and on some complex stuff, so thank you for that. I guess I had a few things. One is we talked a lot about, or you talked about some of the in-lake treatment options. Are there any things that we can think of doing in the watershed itself? As you mentioned, there's been a lot of work done in the ordinances, the 319 grants. Are there other things we can do? You know, what we're trying to do is limit the phosphorus in the lake, and there's limitations to how much we can do because some of it is beyond our control, atmospheric, waterfowl. Are there other watershed activities or efforts that could be taken? And I would say that we had a watershed committee appointed by the select board that I thought was very important in supporting SLA and VLAP, or the state, I should say, in looking at the lake issues and actually driving a number of activities that were helpful. So I'd be interested in any watershed management activities that we could think about. Two, you mentioned the benthic cyanobacteria survey. And I guess I'm wondering how that's done, but we don't have to get into the weeds on that now. I'm just curious about that. But getting back to James's point about drawdown, Spofford has a turnover of 5 years. In other words, the lake is replenished only every 5 years because we don't have a very large watershed. And would a greater drawdown in the winter improve or increase the turnover rate of the lake because you have to replenish the amount that you take down in the spring with fresh water? Is that a factor in considering the winter drawdown level? So I've thrown a lot at you and I'll stop there.
Yes, you did, Chris. Thank you. I thought I had it, and now I'm typing up some quick notes. Okay, we started with watershed, and then benthic mats, and then drawdown. Okay. Did I miss anything? Was there a fourth thing?
No, that's it. You got it.
Okay.
And on the benthic mat, I just hadn't heard about that before, so I was curious. What would you? I think you said just you'd take a boat and do a survey. Is it a pretty simple procedure that we'd be looking at?
Yeah. Well, not necessarily simple. So surprisingly, there's not a lot of work done on benthic cyanobacteria in lakes. It's very widely with a common survey that's done in rivers, but in lakes it's hard, right? Because usually you're having to scuba dive or have an underwater drone to document that. So I don't scuba dive, but I do have an underwater drone, and I did do a pilot survey this past year over at Paugus Bay in Laconia, and it went really well. So it'd be from a boat, and I would just stick something in the water that would video record, and we would, because we'd be covering kind of a larger area on the western shoreline, we'd probably have to transect it out before we would find a mat, right? And then we could start documenting some GPS points, and then sending something down to grab a sample and bring it up so we can look at it under the microscope. For the watershed, obviously, you guys have done amazing work. I know we've already been focusing on some projects like Pinnacle Springs Road with this latest implementation project, which is, on the western side. So I think because of this, what appears to be a western shoreline issue with these benthic cyanobacteria, I'd be curious if anyone, has seen them on the eastern side of Spofford Lake. So far, from what I've heard, they've only been occurring on the western side. there are some tributary outflows with some elevated, some of the highest phosphorus concentrations coming to that western side. So I think prioritizing projects that address runoff and also maybe septic systems too along that western shoreline to try to drive down what's maybe continually enriching the sediments on those nearshore areas on the western side. If we could prioritize that, I think that would be beneficial. And then drawdown, right? Yes, right. Like to make a drawdown decision like that, you need to carefully think about those things. So that's a great point, Chris, and that's something that you would have to carefully consider. Is you can't draw down the lake too much because it might not refill back to what you would like in the summertime for recreation, or that's beneficial to aquatic life, right? If we're not able to rehydrate those shallow areas. So yeah, all important things, but we can, create a graph that would show a relationship between the drawdown level and the surface area it's covered and water volume, and you can figure that out.
Great, thank you.
Great. Anyone else have questions? Otherwise, I can read a few in the chat, or Laura, you may be able to see them. I know Tim had asked, do we have data or models to estimate the trend in internal phosphorus loading?
Wait, sorry, Kelly, what was the question? Or was that just a
do we
comment?
have any models where we can estimate a trend in the internal phosphorus loading?
Ooh, a model, probably not. And we don't have enough long-term water quality data to estimate that. Theoretically, we could construct a model, but we couldn't use the planning level model that we already have for Spofford Lake, the LLRM. I'd have to move to an advanced model that would require a lot of inputs and a lot of time. So I'm just not sure that would be a good use of your funds. But I understand that would be interesting data to see how maybe it's increasing over time. It would not be a linear increase or stable, right? Internal loading can actually be fairly variable in any given year. That's another reason why I give you a range, and even that range, there's margin of error around that, and that has a lot to do with weather conditions leading up to any given season, and then what happens during that season, right? If you have extreme weather events or droughts, it can either enhance or decrease the severity of internal phosphorus loading.
Right. Next question I see, can wakeboard wave action unleash the benthic mats?
Yes, definitely, if they're in water that could be disturbed. So I don't know if folks saw the Minnesota study that came out this past summer. I thought they did an excellent job and have some really compelling visuals. So if you haven't seen it, they did a boat and wake study, which was great. So what they found was that, and basically confirmed, there's several other studies that show this as well. If you just have like a standard boat, kind of just average boat that just takes off, right? It's sending a pulse of water down into the sediment that immediately disturbs that sediment and resuspends it into the water column, including any benthic mats that are down there. And that's in about 10 feet of water. Wake boats obviously are stronger and they can impact water within, 20 feet of water. So, so yes, if you've got boats that are within that 10 to 20 feet of water or shallower, and they're not going at kind of headway speeds, yes, there's a risk that they're stirring those mats up.
Got it. Thank you. Next question was about fall leaf droppings into the lake and contributing to phosphorus levels. New Hampshire Lakes recently had an article about that. Is there any way to control the phosphorus loading with that?
That's so interesting. I get that question all the time, and I commend people for, trying to be conscientious and controlling all the phosphorus sources. But it is a natural source, right? There's just, there's no way to control it from falling into the water, right? And it's contributing such a minor source of phosphorus compared to all the phosphorus sources that we introduce as humans from our development and our activities on the landscape. New Hampshire Lakes does provide some guidance to say, though, that, if you have leaves that fall on your property, that maybe are at risk for, blowing into the lake, that they have provided some guidance to maybe pull those leaves, away, maybe into a compost pile, to limit that source. But otherwise, you want to just leave the natural stuff, the natural duff, try not to rake, leaving it as natural as possible, is the way to go.
Got it. And then there was a comment about, and it was on the southeastern shore, along South Shore Road, there was a benthic mat in the spring. And then back in 2020, if you recall, that was reported to DNS at the B&K had, I think it was in 2019 or 2020, and that's kind of beginning of Eastern Shore area too, I believe. So nothing else that I'm aware of there, but that was brought up in the comments, and he's correct. It's kind of on the southern part, and then B&K sort of the northern part of that Eastern Shore. So there were two benthic mat areas. Let's see, I'm trying to look. So a question is about certainly the salt in the winter from Route 9 contributing the problems. And I know you've probably seen the data on that. We talked about it at the annual meeting as well, that it's there, and that's something that we need to work. We've been working with the town on, but Route 9 obviously is controlled by the state. And as many of you know, is quite a high traffic and high accident road. And that's been their response, is that, the risk of additional accidents, but it's something we can continue to try to work with the state on, who controls the salt on Route 9.
Yeah.
But do you have any other comments, from other lakes with?
Chloride from road salt is sort of this sleeping beast in lakes across New Hampshire. And most all of our lakes show an increasing trend in chloride concentrations. And it is impacting our systems. It might be relatively small now, or maybe we just don't understand the full magnitude. But the higher it gets, right, the more it's impacting a lot of those sensitive organisms in the water. And I talked about in my presentation that top-down control on algae. Some of our zooplankton species are very sensitive to elevated chloride concentrations, and there is some studies that are showing that they don't do well, right? It changes the community composition. It's less, and that means there's less things that are eating the algae that we want to control. So there's a lot of things that are not working in our favor with climate change and road salt. So the more you can do to reverse that trend, the better. I have seen success stories with that. Not too far from you guys. It's a smaller watershed like you, and that's why they were able to see such immediate results. They were all town-owned roads, so they had more control over it, but they basically stopped salting the roads, and they were on a significant increasing trend, and they made huge efforts in the town to just stop the salting, and it's completely flatlined, and now it's actually going down and flushing out of the system, and it's inspiring to see, right, that like it can, if we really tried, right, it could reverse itself. So, but it gets harder the bigger the watershed and the more towns that are involved, and of course when we get state involved with bigger highways, and then it becomes like a major safety issue. So it's a battle.
And in terms of homeowners with things like phosphorus and chloride, what about using detergents with phosphorus and cleaning going into septic? How much is getting into the lake? And same thing with water softeners. I think a lot of people around the lake use salt in their water softening systems. And do you think that's having a significant impact?
Yeah. So if you're using a water softener, which is salt, that is going through your septic system and leach fields, and ultimately discharging into native soils that hits shallow groundwater and would go to the lake. How much that's contributing, right? It's hard to say. I would have to know how many water softeners there are and how much they're actually using any given year. Because you have a state road running through the southern part of your watershed that is, heavily salted, it's more than likely relatively small compared to that, but it still contributes. So, and then same with phosphorus. Most of our products now with detergents, don't have the phosphates in them anymore, which is good, but always check the label, because that can also make its way through your system.
Great. Any other questions for Laura that we missed, or hands up, things in the chat you want addressed? I see. What about the geese?
Yeah, waterfowl can also be an issue, spreading awareness to folks, making sure that they're not feeding, the ducks and the geese, or making conditions friendly for them, right? They love coming up on shorelines that have nice mowed grass, right? They don't like high grass, so if you can have more of a buffer and leave your grass higher, they're not as enticed to come up, and certainly don't encourage them and feed them. Occasionally you get folks that get really excited about having the ducks and the geese, but it's not great to encourage them to congregate like that.
Well, thank you, Laura, for being here. We really appreciate it. Again, there's obviously more work to do, and we will regroup. We just got results back this month, and Laura did a lot of work to put this together. And so there's no shortage of work to be done. We're always looking for additional board members, volunteers to help us in many of these initiatives. So we will continue to be really focused on this water quality. But thank you for joining. Thank you again, Laura. Excellent presentation and very informative, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all, and have a wonderful evening.
Great, thanks. You all too.